Thanks very much. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay, so my name is Dan Putnam. I'm at University of California at Davis, and I have worked pretty much all over California on alfalfa issues, particularly with irrigation, but also with other issues, port quality and economics, as well as pest management. So there's a few things that I'm going to pass around. So I'm going to make one or two comments here about alfalfa. One is this one right here called Alfalfa and Forage News, which is a blog. Anybody know what a blog is? A blog for alfalfa. Now, who would have thought that we have a blog on alfalfa? But we do. So periodically, Pete and others are putting information out about pest management, about new pests that we're seeing around the state. We're also putting information about irrigation and many other issues on that blog. I recently wrote a little article for that saying alfalfa is the best crop to have in a drought. And in that blog, I make the case that alfalfa is a crop that, even though it gets often skewered by those who don't understand agriculture very well for its high water use, but indeed, it's proven this year that the flexibility of alfalfa during a drought period is one of its features that I think is proving to be quite valuable to farmers. And depending upon the water situation in a given area, and you heard Cannon talk about how they were cut back very severely here on Bowles Farming for their water use, and they're moving their water from plot to plot depending upon which crops are the most profitable for them. And certainly canning tomatoes this year is one of the most profitable crops you can grow. And the same is true up in the Davis Woodland area, where many farmers have had to dry down their alfalfa this year due to lack of water supplies. Unlike many crops, this is something you can do successfully with alfalfa and still expect to have, in most cases, a crop the following year. In other words, alfalfa actually originated in a part of the world which consists of long, hot, dry summers and wet winters. Of course, that resembles a part of the world that we know very well here in California. We have long, hot, dry summers and wet winters in general. And as, of course, you go further south, we get less and less wet in the wintertime. But in many parts of the northern part of the San Joaquin Valley, we do get recharge in the winter periods from rainfall or from availability of irrigation water. So we've done studies over the last 10 or 15 years on what we call deficit irrigation of alfalfa. And we have basically several choices here when we're faced with low water year in alfalfa. Number one, we can either elect not to, just basically get rid of the fields, and certainly older alfalfa fields would be candidates for this. So if you have a weedy alfalfa field that really is on the edge of giving up the ghost anyway, that's probably a good year to stop watering that field, to plow it under, wait for a time when you have water to maybe rotate to a different crop. The second is a strategy we call starvation diet. So we can irrigate the crop just smaller amounts all the way through the year. And we would not recommend this as a way of dealing with a drought period. Generally speaking, we'd like to see lots of irrigation water early and then sudden what we call cold turkey cutoffs in midsummer. The reason for that is the following. The crop actually yields much more during the first several cuttings of the year than in the late summer due to what we call summer slump. So even under fully irrigated conditions, we'll see lower yields in the late summer than we do in the early part of the year. Secondly, the quality is almost always better in the first couple of cuttings of the year. So first cutting, second cutting, alfalfa, unless it gets rained on, is usually the best quality of the year. So if you have limited water supply, and in this area we would estimate the total demand for alfalfa to be about 48 to 52 inches per year, so that's about 4 feet of water. And if you have only 1.5 to 2 acre feet in that given year to allocate to that crop, we would recommend that you allocate a lot of that up front. In other words, you try to fill the profile at the beginning of the year, irrigate it as long as you can up until, say, mid-June or early July, and then do a sudden cutoff and allow the crop to dry down in late summer. As you can see in this field here, this field was actually not irrigated at all during any part of this year, according to Ken and Michael, and yet we still have 3 good cuttings out of this field. So we're, typically we'll see if you allocate like 40 to 50% of the water that's required by the crop, we'll typically see 60 or even 70% of the total season-long yields for that crop if you go for an early season full irrigation followed by a summer cutoff. Of course, it helps quite a bit that you have, in this case, high water tables, and so it's going to be very, very soil dependent and soil and situation dependent. We've seen situations where you stopped irrigating in May, which is what they did here, that you would see completely brown and non-productive fields by this time of the year, depending upon the soils. And so we've seen that in many different parts of California. But it sort of reveals the strength of the crop in a drought year, that you can essentially roll with the punches in a drought year and deficit irrigate the crop and still move that water to another use, and then hopefully next year you'll come back with a full crop. We have seen in some cases that this does not work, and it's mainly in the deserts of California, the Blythe and Imperial Valley, where the conditions are so much harsher than they are up here. You have salt conditions, plus you have 120-degree temperatures, and we've seen a lot more stand losses in those areas than we have in the San Joaquin Valley on these good soil types. We actually had a variety trial at the Westside Field Station that we irrigated with saline water for 3 years, and then we dried it down in 2013 and 2014 with 0 irrigation water, and that crop is still going. And so we were kind of impressed by that, and it's able to use, because of the deep root systems, water that's available only 5 to 10 feet down in the soil, and is able to keep from completely dying. So those are all contained in this publication that we came out with called Drought Tips. And thinking of it more on a farming systems point of view, alfalfa does offer that flexibility on a ranching system, so that you can get partial yields in a drought year, and that's actually not as feasible with many other crops. If you say, well, I'm going to irrigate my tomato crop only 40% of its total needs, I would venture to guess you would not get 40% of the yields of that crop. So there are some crops that are much more conducive to deficit irrigation strategies than others. I also wanted to mention that in terms of the pest management issues, which are kind of the theme today in IPM, that there's some things I'd like to say about stand establishment, because stand establishment, whether it's in a flood irrigated situation like this, sprinkle irrigated, or with buried drip irrigation, which a lot of growers are giving a try, is really one of the most key things you can do. And there's a whole series of recommendations that we have for stand establishment that are related to its ability to withstand pests, particularly weeds, but also insects and also diseases. So the first of those recommendations would be to plant on time. So I guess I would ask you guys, what do you think is the best time to plant alfalfa in this area around here, Los Banos? Anybody have an idea? What's that? October. September. What did you say?
October, 1st of October.
1st of October. Okay, that's excellent. And so many growers historically in California, moving here from the Midwest about 25 years ago, I began to say, wow, you can actually plant a crop in January. And sometimes you can succeed, but the fact is that's not the best time to plant an alfalfa crop. The ideal time to plant alfalfa is probably mid-September through early October. Typically, we would recommend, if you have the water, a pre-irrigation step to try to take care of existing weeds and also to settle the crop and to land level correctly, to allow excellent water type of movement over the flood irrigated fields in this case. But the key issue here is to, in the first 6 months of production, is to grow the crop for the roots, not for the foliage. So we're so eager to start harvesting this crop that sometimes we don't realize that you have to set the crop up. It's a perennial crop. It's a very slow-growing seedling, and we want to get that up and going so that those roots do go down 6 feet or deeper, so that you can withstand drought, you can withstand pest problems, and that you can crowd out the invading weeds. And so I've seen so many failures of alfalfa that have come from not planting at the right time of year, coming in say late November when it's cold and wet, and the crop takes 10 or 15 days to come up, and you get weeds intruding, and so it's a big problem for weed intrusion. It's also a big problem because the crop does not then withstand insect pressures later on in the year, and also you don't have the ability to withstand droughty conditions, which is what we have here. So I think this ranch, they definitely try to plant it in the mid-September period of time. The later, I've seen situations like at UC Davis where I've waited 2 weeks to plant a trial, and I've seen yields that I've been penalized on the order of a ton or a ton and a half per acre by waiting 2 weeks. So timeliness is a key issue there. The other thing I wanted to mention is variety. Now, particularly for pest management, some of the only protection we have against some pests is in variety selection. So in this area, we definitely would highly recommend resistant lines to stem nematode, to blue alfalfa aphid, to the aphid complex, to Phytophthora fusarium, and alfalfa actually has a whole list of diseases and insects that it is resistant to. So I provided in the handout here the most recent data from Modesto and from the Kearney Ag Center over in Fresno County that is a 3-year data set of the performance of different varieties under those conditions. And so we would recommend that you look at approximately the top third of those trials for the candidate varieties, which tend to yield well in this area, and also to go through those varieties and double check whether they have resistances to the kinds of pests that you will see in that field. And this is something particularly that PCAs can be very effective at recommending highly resistant varieties for particularly things like stem nematode, where we've seen a lot of trouble around here. As you go further north, we've seen a lot of issues with stem nematode, and so one of those things you don't think about every year, but when it comes in, you'd be glad to have a little bit more resistance in your varieties. So I think if you can take a look at these drought tips, there's like I say, there's both good news and bad news, and certainly the alfalfa growers in California have had a hard time with the drought. We've seen huge cutbacks in both acreage and production in California, but the fact is it is a resilient crop that will come back another day to yield well. So with that, I think I'll open it up for questions if anybody has questions about alfalfa or about some of the irrigation stuff that we're doing. I will actually mention that we're doing a whole project. I'd like to introduce here Daniele Zachariah, who's our irrigation specialist at UC Davis. And we're working quite closely with companies like Netafim and others to look at buried drip in alfalfa. And so this is something that's been of strong interest in many parts of the state. We have probably something like 20 to 30,000 acres in California that have been put into buried drip, some in Imperial Valley, some in the San Joaquin Valley, and up through the Sacramento Valley. Essentially don't have anything in the Intermountain area in buried drip, but there's certainly been a lot of interest in this region. Why has there been interest? Okay, there's two driving forces. One, yield. And alfalfa is a crop which, under flood irrigation, we know that there are limitations to how quickly we can get water on these fields to satisfy the water needs of the crop. And drip irrigation holds the promise of that, of changing that equation so we can get water much more quickly onto this crop to allow regrowth to occur and increase yields. Many of our growers have, in fact, the average report from the, we've visited now about 13 or 14 alfalfa fields in California that have been put into varied drip all over the state. And the average report from the growers is an increase of yield of about 2 to 2.5 tons of hay compared with their check flood systems. And I think there's a reason for that, and a lot of the reason has to do with the timeliness of irrigation, the fact that you can keep that soil away from these wetting and drying periods that we see so much with check flood fields, and to more consistently provide water throughout the growing season. And so those are some of the advantages of varied drip in alfalfa. What are the disadvantages? Well, Bulls Farming here has certainly had some experience with that, and so have many of our growers. And the key issue there is gopher and rodent management. And I'd have to give you all a stern warning that if you're not willing to wrestle with the gopher and rodent management in a very serious way, then I would not try this. You have to really up your management game when it comes to rodent management to try to prevent rodents from becoming too populated in the system, because they are capable of ruining a varied drip irrigation system. And some of the growers have walked away from it as a result. They just cannot manage it. There are other growers that have actually reasonably succeeded in this endeavor, but it is a challenge. And it's one thing that we're continually working on, is to try to figure out how to prevent excessive gopher infestations in varied drip fields. As a vertebrate person said, it's essentially an ideal habitat for rodents. You have food, you have cover, you have water, and they just go nuts. And much more than in tomatoes and in other crops. You really do see a much greater infestation of rodents in varied drip fields. We also have troubles in sprinkler systems with rodents, but it doesn't, fortunately in the case of sprinklers, we don't ruin the irrigation system with our rodents. But in the case of varied drip, they will chew on the lines, they will ruin the lines, they'll cause leaks. And this is a real big challenge, and we're still working on solutions to that. We're not sure whether they're easy ones, but we think that the higher level of management is certainly going to be called for. So any other questions or comments or ideas? Yeah.
This area, what's the best spacing? This area?
Spacing for the, the spacing between the drip lines is going to be highly dependent upon soil type. And we have actually, this is one of the issues that we're exploring in depth. And it depends upon that particular soil and the ability of that soil to what we call sub-over in between the drip lines. The drip lines are usually pretty effective at subbing, down and so forth, but the key issue is what's happening in between drip lines. The most common configuration has been 40 inches between drip lines. We visited a lot of fields last summer where we saw what we call corrugations in the field, where you have good growth, poor growth, good growth, poor growth in those fields. And I think this might be corrected to some degree by a little narrower spacing in the case of alfalfa. Keep in mind that in the case of alfalfa, it's not a row crop. So, in tomatoes, you can irrigate only really around the root system, and you have a cone of water that's directly around those rows, and you don't care as much if there's a little dry area in between the rows. In the case of alfalfa, it does affect the yield potential, and so we're still exploring this issue. I think in some cases 40 inches works well, depending upon whether or not that stand establishment period has been long enough to allow roots to get down into the lower part of the profile. And I think one of the mistakes that people putting drip in have made is that they haven't figured out how to fully charge the profile at the early part of the year. So one of the recommendations that we would make, and Daniele and I have been working on this quite a bit, is to retain your ability to flood irrigate that field, if at all possible. Because, for example, in the beginning of the year, like this year and last year, we had very dry conditions from December all the way through the early part of the growing season, and a lot of growers were not able to fill that profile. So you go in between these drip lines, the rooting depth was very, very short. You had little short roots right over the drip lines. You had very good root development. And so that was one of the problems we've seen almost in every field that we visited last year. And I think they could have corrected it either by allowing some flood irrigation to occur, or secondarily changing their spacings to a little bit narrower spacing. So some of the growers have tried a 30-inch row spacing with the idea that they would go back and forth to, say, tomatoes at 30 and 60s, basically double rows, double laterals on 60-inch centers. So it's going to be very soil type dependent. Yeah. Questions? And
Have you used the flooding to help with the rodents?
Help with the rodents, yes. So the reason that we're recommending to keep flood irrigation capability if you're going to put in a drip field with alfalfa is 3 or 4-fold, right? Number one, rodent control. Because rodents definitely are affected by flood irrigation events. And we can help with the rodent. It won't solve the rodent problem, but it will help. And we do know that we have lower infestation rates in flood irrigated fields than we do in buried drip fields. Secondly is salt management. And in areas of the state where we may get, well, in pretty much almost every area, we would get buildup of salts in drip fields if we did not have a way of moving those salts down past the root zone. So that's another argument for that. The third reason is this idea of filling the profile at strategic times during the year. So if you don't start off with a full profile in the spring, I think it's much more difficult to attain that full profile with your drip system later on in the season. You can maintain a full profile, but to get there is sometimes very hard to do. So I think there's a reason to think of those as integrated together. And we can, there's some advantages to flooding a field. I mean, that's a better way to fill that profile than almost any other system if you have a well set up flood system. But we do know that the advantages of drip irrigation are to keep that profile wet during the critical growth periods and prevent this wetting and drying period. So there's a lot of reasons to think about keeping that ability to flood irrigate in your back pocket.
What about row configuration? Is it corrugated or still borders like regular or flat, or how? Right,
so some of the growers have set it up in very different ways. So some people have kept with kind of a bedded type of situation with drip irrigation, and others have planted on the flat with border checks like in this field here. So you can do it either way. The key issue is to retain that ability to move water across that field, with head ditches and so forth, or with gated pipe or whatever method of delivery you might use. Daniele might want to comment on some of these things, but it's there are lots of different ways of thinking through that issue. But we think that in drip irrigated fields, there's a lot of advantages to drip irrigation, but there are also some reasons that you would consider flood irrigating once in a while over the summer, or say twice a year. I would say twice a year. Probably bring that in as one of your methods of managing gophers as well as managing the water. We could talk, if you have more specific questions, we could explore some of these issues of spacing and so. There's been a lot of interest in drip irrigation in alfalfa, especially since growers have had a lot of good experiences with tomatoes, and they want to see how to rotate tomatoes with their alfalfa, and that's where a lot of that interest has come from. They've seen the increases in yields in their tomatoes, and we believe, and there's enough evidence now, I think, to support this, that there are potential yield increases in alfalfa that are almost of the same order of magnitude, and there's some other advantages too in terms of keeping the surface of the soil dry so you don't get weed germination. You know, we don't get as much tail end damage like you get in some of these flood irrigated fields. So there's a lot of advantages there, but I tell you, you've got to have your game together with gopher management, and that's one of those things that is really a tough one.
Well, that was the next question. Besides using flood as a deterrent, what else is available to combat the gophers? I mean, I know there's Protect T. How effective is it? Are there any other?
We've had mixed results with Protect T. That some of the work that's been done, some of the growers have felt that it's been fairly effective. Other growers have tried it and doesn't think it helps much. One of the things about Protect T, it's a repellent rather than it's not a pesticide. It's a repellent. So it's based upon the behavior of the animals. Okay, so the hope is that you put this stinky material through the water system and the gophers run out and they run away. But you know, you think about this, you know, if you've got this large field here, where the heck are they going to go? And so that's really part of the issue is, at least this is my feeling about it, you know, it's okay, you know, if you're a gopher and you have this stinky material, yeah, it'll be annoying, but you know, you've got everything you need in this field, and why would you leave? And so I think that's maybe part of the issue. We're actually working quite hard to think through this issue of how do you protect a field that has such a large investment in drip irrigation in it from that kind of damage, because it will damage the field, you know, over say 3 to 5 years or 7. You can't keep it in as long as you should because of the gopher infestation. So there's a lot of, I'd say we would call this an integrated approach. I would use every trick in the book. Owl boxes help a little. They're not a solution. Did you have a question?
One thing I found that really good
Is what?
a guy in Choctaw just started a business. And I've been using it quite a bit on alfalfa and stuff. But he's using the pearls with CO2. They got the tank detectors.
Right.
CO2 or whatnot. And then they push it in the ground, cover up the hole, and then push it in the ground. He would have really good.
So this is carbon monoxide? Yeah, carbon monoxide, yeah. So you have to have, I think, permits to use that. We would recommend, trapping is one of the things that actually, because you actually can grab the animal and you know that you've killed it, is one of those reliable things. It takes some labor, though, to do it. So I would use every trick in the book. I've seen that certainly the baits have there's some new baits that our vertebrate pest guy has been working on that is kind of interesting in non-organic fields, or you know, certainly according to the label. Strychnine is one of those. And Pete, do you know about I think strychnine has not been that widely available, but it's kind of proved to be somewhat effective, I think, in some cases, as a bait below ground, of course. And but trapping is one of those things can be used for pretty much organic as well as non-organic fields. And we've also experimented with gopher fences all the way around these fields to keep them from reinvading, because even if you do a good job of picking them out of there for about a year or so, you've got to keep them from coming back in and reinvading. So we're continually trying to challenge ourselves on this issue, but I would say it's not a particularly easy one to solve.
Have you had any luck in putting stuff in the water like say aqua or any tree or anything to knock them out?
So the question is, anything in the water, like in the drip lines?
Yeah.
Well, the Protect T has been the main one that has been recommended so far, and like I say, it's been having sort of mixed results. I think it probably helps to some degree, but it's certainly not going to solve the problem. I don't think, at least at this point. And so I think if it were my field, I would try all of these things and see what was the best. But a lot of it's going to be actually careful monitoring. It's going to be the human beings that are there, and whether it may be hiring somebody that will actually come in and take responsibility for that, or assigning somebody on a ranch to this issue, because you're saving labor on irrigation in the case of drip irrigation, but you're going to spend more labor monitoring those fields. So you can only really monitor alfalfa fields when they're open like this, just after cutting for a week or so, and then really it's really hard to monitor them after that. But there's got to be a human being. I think there's almost no substitute for a human being monitoring those fields. maybe we can do something with drones. I don't know. Maybe somebody can figure that out. That would be kind of cool. So, okay. So I think any other questions? Okay. So I'd like to introduce.
We announced the alfalfa.
Oh yeah. For those of you interested, we're put together the Western Alfalfa and Forage Symposium for Reno, Nevada. It's coming December 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, and we're going to have a whole irrigation management training, which Daniele here has put together along with us, and for how to irrigate alfalfa and forage crops, particularly alfalfa. And so that'll be a full day program. We're going to also have a full day and a half symposium on water issues with alfalfa, but also pest management issues and forage quality and lots of other things. So if you're interested in alfalfa, that's one that you may want to try to consider. So I'd like to introduce Daniele Zachariah, who's our irrigation specialist at UC Davis, who will talk about some of the drought programs